Hello, and welcome to Form-Based Codes, a brief overview of principles and components. My name is Spencer Johnson, and I'm a lead associate with Lisa Wise Consulting. I'm joined today by Roger Eastman, who's a director with Lisa Wise Consulting. Now, form-based codes are an alternative approach to conventional zoning code regulation. They prioritize building form over land use. Now, typically, conventional zoning codes lead to places that look like this, where land use is separate and surface parking lots dominate the site. Form-based codes, however, prioritize regulating context of the built environment to implement walkable areas. A form-based code addresses the relationship of private development to public space. It aims to implement vibrant, mixed-use places and main streets that we like to frequent. Now, many vision documents include policy statements like this that say, infill and develop in existing urbanized areas. Build affordable multifamily housing near transportation corridors. Now, in reading the statement, you might picture something that looks kind of like this. It's an active, vibrant area with multimodal transportation options, has a mix of uses, and multifamily housing. However, without the right tools, you could end up with something that looks like this. There's a disconnect here between the private development and the street or public space. Now, builders will build what the code allows them to build, but we need a code that results in more vibrant areas. So we need regulations that provide a connection to public space. And while this picture might theoretically meet that vision statement, it's definitely not what we envision. Now, the problem is, so many of our zoning codes are based on land use. This is the conventional zoning approach. And over the years, conventional zoning just hasn't been suiting the needs of a more modern economy. It's very difficult to connect separate land uses without utilizing a convoluted network of streets. Pedestrian connections aren't always in common sense locations. For example, here, the photo on the right shows a pedestrian connection from a residential subdivision. It brings you into the retail center, but it kind of leaves you in the loading docks. Zoning regulations and maps can also be too broad brush. The photos shown here are both examples of areas within commercial zones. So they're both commercial, but their character is entirely different. And the problem is conventional zoning just doesn't provide certainty to make sure you get the image on the right. So in order to get more walkable urban places, we need to make sure we write regulations that implement them. Drivable suburban areas are more reliant on land use, and walkable areas are more reliant on building form.
So a very useful tool for creating the kind of walkable environment that Spencer's talking about is a form-based code. And this definition from the Form-Based Code Institute is the classic go-to definition. And essentially it's saying that a form-based code enables predictable, high-quality built environments by putting a focus on regulating land development based on physical form. That is to say, the relationship of buildings to buildings and physical to the street. And the public realm. So form-based code typically will also regulate the street space itself. And this is more important than the separation of land uses, which is the typical approach in a conventional zoning code. Form-based codes are place-based. That means they're specific to individual communities or individual cities. So while many of the elements are the same, the specifics of the code will be different from one city to another. And form-based codes will also enable streamlining of housing development because design standards are objective, and that makes it easier. So if we think about a conventional code and a form-based code graphically, the conventional code is focused on use and density and the standards that support use primarily, and form is very secondary to the conventional zoning code. Management, of course, is an important part. You do need somebody to administer the code. On the other hand, a form-based code thinks about the form of buildings and public places first. And so there's a strong reliance on different sets of standards to create that result. Use is important. You've got to be thoughtful about how you mix uses in a mixed use development and along in a main street. So use is never forgotten. but it's not as important as the form standards. And then, of course, you still have the implementation standards through the management of the code. Now, a form-based code, as I mentioned before, really focuses not just on the buildings, but on that relationship between buildings and the streetscape itself. A form-based code is based on a map that's very similar to a zoning map. And the zoning map for a form-based code is often called a regulating plan. And it's based on what we call the transect approach, where we think about a city based on the different characters of places within the city. That is to say, what is the most urban part of the city, what we might call transect zone 6, or what is the least urban or most natural part of the city, transect zone T1, or the natural zone. And then in between, we have different characters of places based on the intensity of urbanism and the character of that urbanism, like a main street in T4 general urban zone, and in the T3 suburban zone, primarily residential, but all within a walkable context. We may land up with special districts too for things like university complexes or high school campuses. So the regulating plan is based on the transect, and the regulating plan is the equivalent of the zoning map. And you can see it on the top left portion of this slide. So once you've allocated your different transect zones or form-based zones through the regulating plan, then you establish the building form standards unique to each transect zone. And this is where you'd set up standards for each different type of building, like an apartment building, a townhouse building, or a shopfront building, or a mixed-use building. And you'd also establish standards for the frontage of the building, how high it may be, and so on. And then you establish, in general, the public space standards for the different types of streets or the different types of civic spaces like parks or plazas or green spaces. So a form-based code will both regulate private and public streets, and it does it in a way that's well illustrated, as we'll demonstrate in a minute, very transparent and very predictable, which is different to a conventional code, which is typically text-heavy with fewer graphics, strong emphasis on metrics, and a conventional zoning code regulates private spaces only. So here are some sample pages of some different form-based codes. You can see on the left-hand side, we were introducing a transect zone that we're calling the neighborhood form-based zoning district, or the neighborhood transect zone. We always include an intent statement and then establish lot standards, building placement standards, the different building types that might be permitted. You would also include, as you can see under the frontage type standards, different standards for what the front of the building should look like, whether it should be a porch or a stoop or a courtyard or some other similar space. And then you'd include the civic space standards as well. In this case, for a plaza, it could well be for a courtyard or some kind of a green and so on. Now, if we move on, you can often see that a form-based code produces a predictable space. And you can see this in these images here, where the built results of form-based codes are becoming more and more present across American cities. Form-based codes are becoming more popular and more well-liked and appreciated by many communities. Here in Las Vegas, the lower left image, this is a mixed-use building in the Fremont Street district of downtown Las Vegas. And this project has been incredibly successful with a strong retail component on the ground floor and apartments on the upper floors. The Mesa, Arizona example was a form-based code built around a light rail that transformed a very heavily auto-dominated main street to a predictable walkable space with very active frontages and very, very successful mixed-use developments of commercial on the ground floor and residences above. And similarly in Petaluma with an older code, been very successful over the years, as you can see in the image below. Now, form-based codes, as I mentioned before, have become very common across the United States. Their benefits are that they're place-based. They're written unique to one community. Even though the elements within the form-based code may be common, their standards are specific to the community for which they're written. They're prescriptive. That means that they clearly define how big, how tall, what frontages should be on a building, how those buildings are placed relative to other buildings around them. And so they become, as a result, much more predictable. They're easy to use, they're well illustrated, and standards are codified based on the final desired outcome. And it's that predictability of the desired built form that makes them useful, because developers know what they can expect to build. Neighborhoods understand what will result of that building being constructed through the code. They become useful as a tool for neighborhood and historic preservation, because the standards in the code are derived from the place where that code will be applied. So you're not going to land up with buildings that are out of scale with surrounding neighborhood developments. Form-based codes have been proven to provide very strong economic development, economic benefits in the communities in which they are applied. And because form-based codes promote development, that means people walk more or bike more or take public transit. They're parking their cars more, and as a result of that activity in walking, there's a number of strong health benefits that are common as well. So thank you for joining us on this brief overview of principles and components of form-based codes.